They say the woods around Ashford County never went quiet again after the Holloways came. The year was 1873, a time when superstition and scripture often blurred, when the earth itself still felt wild, untamed. But what settled on that lonely stretch of Kentucky farmland wasn't the kind of wild anyone could understand. The Holloway family moved there with nothing but a horse, a wagon, and a dream of peace. But peace does not thrive where the unnatural breathes. When their children were born, there was no cry, only the sound of wind pressing against the windows, as if the world itself held its breath. Neighbors said the infants opened their eyes the moment they touched air, staring at the midwife with an expression too knowing, too calm. Within days, the babies no longer crawled. They walked. Within weeks, they mimicked words they shouldn't have understood. The doctor called it advanced growth. The preacher called it God's warning. But whatever it was, it made the farm's soil turn black under their bare feet. At night, faint laughter drifted from the Holloway home, not playful, not human. Some said the family was blessed, others swore they'd made a pact. No one went near their property after dark, not after the Reverend returned from a visit pale as bone, muttering that those weren't children anymore. And yet the Holloways remained, until one storm tore through Kentucky, and the house burned from the inside out. When dawn came, the family was gone. No bodies, no ashes, only two small sets of footprints pressed into the soot, leading into the forest, where they say the air still hums when the wind is right, like children whispering to something that shouldn't be there. The Holloway family's arrival in 1873 marked the beginning of something the people of Ashford County would never understand, though they tried to make sense of it through gossip, superstition, and whispered warnings. The land they chose lay on the outskirts of town, surrounded by thick Kentucky woods where mist clung to the ground even at noon, and the crows seemed to gather in unnatural numbers. Locals avoided that area, calling it Devil's Acre, a place where compasses spun aimlessly and crops grew too quickly before rotting in the soil. Yet to the Holloways, the land represented salvation. Thomas Holloway, a quiet but determined man, had fled the noise of the industrial towns to find peace for his wife, Margaret, who had been sickly since losing their first two children. The world had taken too much from them, and they wanted to start over somewhere the past couldn't find them. When Thomas purchased the abandoned property for a price too low to make sense, the townsfolk assumed he had tricked some desperate landowner. No one mentioned that the last family who lived there vanished without a trace during a winter storm 10 years earlier. The first day the Holloways arrived, the air seemed heavier, as though the woods themselves recognized new blood. Thomas stood in the field beside his wagon, surveying the warped fence posts and the half-collapsed barn. He spoke little, only nodded to his wife as she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the dark tree line that pressed too close to the back of the property. The couple's wagon creaked under the weight of their belongings, an iron bed frame, a chest of linens, and a cradle Thomas had carved himself. Margaret's belly was swollen with life, and though her face was pale, her expression carried a quiet kind of hope. She often said the baby would be their redemption, a sign that the world hadn't fully turned its back on them. But as the days passed and the wind whistled through the broken windows of their new home, that hope began to feel fragile. The townspeople watched the Holloways from a distance, uneasy with the family's isolation. They didn't attend church, and Thomas declined every offer of help, insisting he could rebuild the house himself. Some said they saw strange lights flickering inside the home long after midnight. Others swore they heard crying in the fields, though no one could tell if it was a child or something else mimicking one. The old women in town shook their heads and said Margaret had gone to cursed ground, and when her child came, it would not be right. Still, no one warned the Holloways directly. Fear and curiosity often held hands in Ashford County, and people preferred to watch from afar rather than interfere with what they didn't understand. By the time autumn came, the house stood tall again, repaired with wood Thomas had cut himself from the surrounding forest. The trees he felled seemed to bleed sap darker than usual, and when the logs were split, a sour scent lingered in the air, something sharp that burned the back of the throat. The preacher passed by once on his horse and saw Thomas burying something in the yard, something small, wrapped in burlap. and he chose not to ask what it was. There was a strange calmness around the Holloways, the kind that doesn't feel like peace but silence before a storm. One evening, as the sun set over the hills, Margaret stood at the window watching shadows stretch across the fields. She said later she saw shapes moving between the trees, figures that looked human but walked in perfect unison, like reflections in a mirror. Thomas told her it was only her nerves, the wind playing tricks, but even he couldn't explain why the horses refused to go near the barn that night. When the moon rose red and swollen over the horizon, Margaret clutched her stomach and whispered that the baby was coming. Outside, the woods had gone utterly still, as though waiting for something to arrive with them. The night Samuel and Clara Holloway came into the world was unlike any other in Ashford County. The sky was red, not the kind of red that fades with the setting sun, but a deep, bruised crimson that stained the clouds and refused to dim. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, though none fell, and the wind carried a faint hum that made the lantern flames inside the Holloway house flicker and bend. Margaret's cries echoed through the narrow hall, but there was something off about them. Soft at first, then fading into silence, as though the pain had simply been swallowed by the night itself. Thomas, pale and trembling, had ridden 2 miles to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Penner, who arrived just before midnight with her satchel clutched to her chest and her face pale from the strange stillness that hung around the property. She would later tell the townsfolk that as she approached the house, the sound of crickets stopped entirely, and for a moment she thought time itself had paused. Inside, Margaret lay on the bed drenched in sweat, her eyes wide open and unfocused, muttering that the children were already awake. Mrs. Penner tried to soothe her, brushing damp hair from her forehead, but her words faltered when the first child came. The boy was silent, no cry, no struggle for breath, just an eerie calm as he opened his eyes immediately and stared at her with pupils so dark they seemed to absorb the lamplight. Before she could even cut the cord, his tiny hand reached out and gripped her wrist with a strength that made her flinch. She gasped, calling for Thomas, but before he could react, the second child arrived. The girl, just as quiet, her eyes the same deep shade, her expression mirroring her brother's in perfect, unsettling symmetry. Mrs. Penner insisted the infants were alive. They moved, they breathed, but their stillness was wrong. Most newborns tremble, cry, squirm as they adjust to the world, but these two simply observed, their heads turning toward sounds in the room with a slow precision that no infant should have possessed. Thomas tried to comfort his wife, but Margaret seemed transfixed by the children. She whispered that they recognized her, that they had been waiting for this night. When Mrs. Penner suggested baptizing them immediately, Thomas hesitated, uneasy with the way the twins' eyes followed her every movement. He later said he felt watched not by children, but by something ancient peering through them. As the night went on, a strange stillness fell over the house. The clock on the mantel had stopped, the fire in the hearth burned lower though no one touched it, and outside, the wood seemed to press closer to the windows. When Mrs. Penner reached to swaddle the infants, they turned their heads toward her at the same moment, their gaze so sharp it made her hands shake. She excused herself soon after, muttering that she needed fresh air. On the porch, she found the world unnervingly silent. No wind, no insects, only the faint sound of something rustling far off in the woods, rhythmic and slow, almost like breathing. Before dawn, Thomas walked her to her horse. She refused payment, saying only that he should pray for guidance, though her voice trembled when she spoke. As she rode away, she couldn't shake the image of the twins' eyes watching her from the window, their faces pale in the lantern light. Later, when she tried to tell others about that night, her words came out fractured, uncertain. All she could say was that they were born awake, and that no one, not even God, should see a child look at the world the way those two did. Back at the Holloway house, Margaret lay with the infants asleep beside her, though even in rest, their fingers twitched and their lips moved faintly, as if repeating something they had heard long before they were born. Within the first weeks after their birth, it became clear that Samuel and Clara Holloway were not like other children. At first, Thomas and Margaret dismissed the oddities as coincidences or signs of strength. The babies rarely cried, And when they did, it was not from hunger or discomfort. It was as though they were mimicking what they thought a human cry should sound like, a hollow echo that never reached the eyes. Margaret began noticing things she couldn't explain. When she'd enter their room at dawn, she'd find the twins already awake, standing inside their cradle as if waiting for her. Their limbs moved with startling coordination for infants, their gazes fixed on her every motion. At 2 weeks old, Samuel reached out and took a spoon from her hand, gripping it with the steadiness of a grown child. Clara followed his actions perfectly, her tiny hand mimicking his movements like a reflection. Thomas tried to rationalize it. He told himself the babies were simply strong, that Margaret's imagination was running wild in the quiet isolation of the farm. But when he saw them take their first steps at barely a month old, his denial faltered. There was no stumbling, no clumsy attempt to balance. They walked with certainty, their bare feet silent on the wooden floor. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat by the fire, staring at their cradle and listening to the faint sound of them whispering to each other, their voices too low to understand, yet oddly rhythmic, like a chant. The sound filled him with unease he couldn't name, something primal that told him what he was hearing didn't belong in a child's mouth. The townsfolk began to notice changes in the Holloways. Thomas grew withdrawn, avoiding the market and church. Margaret's letters to her sister became erratic, filled with strange remarks about her children's eyes, how they seemed to see too much. The midwife, Mrs. Penner, who had sworn never to return after the birth, broke that promise when Thomas came to her door one rainy evening. His face was drawn, his voice hollow. He said the twins no longer slept, not truly. They only pretended to, their breathing shallow, their eyes flickering beneath closed lids as if watching dreams they controlled. When Mrs. Penner hesitated, he whispered something that made her skin crawl. That sometimes he woke to find them standing at the foot of his bed, watching him in the dark. Rumors spread quickly through Ashford County. Some said the Holloways had dabbled in witchcraft to conceive after years of loss. Others claimed they had built their home on cursed ground. Children dared each other to walk past the Holloway farm at dusk, swearing they saw the twins staring from the window, perfectly still, their faces blank. One neighbor, a trapper named Eli Mercer, claimed he found small footprints near the edge of the forest, bear prints too small for any grown person, but too perfect, too deliberate, as if made by something that knew how to imitate human form. He said the ground around them was warm, even in the cold. Inside the house, the atmosphere grew heavy. Margaret tried to mother her children as best she could, but the longer she watched them, the more she sensed something was wrong. They didn't laugh, didn't coo or babble. They only watched. Sometimes she would turn her back for a moment and find them standing in different positions when she looked again, as though time had skipped forward without her. She began hearing them whispering when no one else was in the room, sometimes to her, sometimes to the shadows. Once she caught Samuel repeating her own prayers word for word, in her exact voice. The night Thomas found them sitting by the hearth with their hands in the ashes drawing perfect circles in the soot. He finally understood what the preacher had meant when he said some things come into the world already knowing what they shouldn't know. From that night on, he barred the door after dark, though deep down he knew it wouldn't matter. The twins had already stopped being children. Reverend Alden was not a man easily frightened. He had buried soldiers, delivered sermons during plague seasons, and once performed a blessing in a house so decayed it collapsed the following week. But when he heard the stories about the Holloway twins, something in his faith stirred uneasily. The reports came to him in fragments, a midwife speaking of children born awake, a farmer muttering about footprints in the mud that led nowhere, and whispers of voices that spoke in unison during the night. The preacher dismissed them at first as rural hysteria, the kind that spread in quiet towns when winter came too soon and the nights grew long. But the more he heard, the more he felt compelled to see the family for himself. It was his duty, he reasoned, to ensure no evil had taken root among his flock. Yet when he saddled his horse that gray October morning, the air felt wrong, charged with an anticipation that set his teeth on edge. The Holloway farm sat miles from town, surrounded by forest so dense it swallowed sound. As Reverend Alden approached, he noticed how still everything seemed. No birds called from the trees, no insects buzzed. Even his horse began to resist, nostrils flaring as though smelling something that didn't belong. The house appeared ordinary from a distance, smoke rising from the chimney, a curtain stirring in the upper window. But as he drew closer, he saw that the smoke wasn't gray, but a faint, reddish hue, like dust mixed with ember. He dismounted, tied the reins to a fence post, and walked the path to the porch, every step sinking deeper into silence. Thomas Holloway greeted him at the door, though his expression was hollow, his skin pale and drawn. His clothes were clean but rumpled, his eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. When the Reverend asked if his family was well, Thomas hesitated before answering, as if unsure what the word meant anymore. He invited the preacher inside, voice flat and toneless. The air within the house was heavy, faintly metallic, and the dim light from the windows seemed to bend away from certain corners. Reverend Alden noticed children's drawings pinned to the wall, circles intersecting lines, strange runic symbols no child should have known. Thomas caught his gaze and muttered that the twins liked to draw the things they saw. When asked what that meant, Thomas only said, "They said the shapes helped them listen better." Margaret appeared from the hallway, her face pale but serene, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. She seemed almost peaceful until the Reverend realized her eyes didn't quite meet his. They flickered past him, focusing on something just over his shoulder, though when he turned, the space behind him was empty. She offered tea, but her voice trembled as she spoke, and her words came slightly delayed, as though echoing from another room. Then came the sound of soft footsteps above them. The Reverend looked up, startled, and saw two small shadows moving in perfect synchrony across the ceiling boards. Before he could speak, Thomas placed a hand on his arm and whispered that it was better not to interrupt them when they played. The preacher insisted on seeing the children. Thomas led him to a small upstairs room. The air grew colder with each step, and the wooden floor groaned beneath their weight. When the door opened, the twins were standing by the window, their faces turned toward the forest outside. They did not turn when the men entered, not until the Reverend whispered a prayer under his breath. Then, in unison, the children turned their heads, slowly, deliberately, and smiled. The smile was faint, polite, almost human, but their eyes reflected no light, only a depth that made the Reverend's knees weaken. He tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. Thomas closed the door behind them and asked if he would bless the house. The Reverend agreed, though his hands trembled so badly he dropped his Bible once. As he prayed, the twins began humming softly, their voices harmonizing with a strange tone that made the air vibrate. The room grew darker, and for a moment he thought he heard other voices joining in from the walls, faint and distant but unmistakably real. When it ended, he stumbled from the house, barely able to breathe. He never spoke of what he saw again, only told the townsfolk that the Holloways should be left alone. Some said he burned his Bible weeks later and never preached another sermon in that county. By the winter of 1873, the Holloway farm had become a place people crossed themselves when passing. The family rarely came into town anymore, and when they did, their presence carried a kind of stillness that lingered even after they were gone. Margaret no longer smiled. Thomas spoke little, and the twins, Samuel and Clara, who should have been babbling toddlers by then, were eerily quiet, watchful, calculating, their eyes always fixed on something unseen. At night, the neighbors began to report strange noises drifting across the open fields. What began as faint echoes soon grew unmistakable, the laughter of children, high and musical, echoing through the fog long after midnight. But those who listened too closely claimed it wasn't laughter at all. There was a rhythm to it, an uneven cadence, as if something else was breathing between the giggles, weaving words through the sound. Eli Mercer, the trapper who lived nearest to the Holloways, was the first to speak of the voices openly. One evening while checking his traps, he heard children calling his name from the trees. The sound was clear, even playful, but when he called back, the laughter stopped abruptly. Then, just as suddenly, it began again, this time behind him. He turned and saw nothing but mist curling through the branches. He fled home, locked every window, and told his wife that the Holloway children were playing where no children should be. Others began to share their own encounters. Some said they heard soft humming carried on the wind, the same lullaby Mrs. Holloway used to sing when she first moved in. Others claimed they saw two small figures wandering the fields under moonlight, their steps perfectly matched, their faces turned toward the sky. Inside the Holloway house, something had begun to unravel. Margaret's journals, later found among the ruins, spoke of nights when she would wake to find the twins standing beside her bed, whispering words she didn't understand. She wrote that they spoke of the deep ones and of the space beneath the trees where the light doesn't go. She said they told her secrets about people in town, things no child could possibly know. Thomas dismissed it all until he started hearing the voices himself. He would be in the barn mending a fence post when faint laughter would echo behind him, though the twins were inside. Sometimes he'd catch them watching him from the window, their faces blank, their lips moving as if repeating his own words in perfect synchrony. By late January, the town's preacher had stopped visiting. The church bells no longer rang for the Holloways, and the people spoke of them only in whispers. Strange patterns began appearing in the snow around their property. Circles, spirals, and symbols etched perfectly into the drifts. The prints leading to them were small and barefoot, yet no one ever saw who made them. Margaret began complaining of headaches, claiming she could hear voices under the ground, murmurs that grew louder when the twins laughed. She said they were teaching her things, showing her how to listen. Thomas begged her to leave the house, but she refused, saying the children needed her to learn properly. One night, the wind howled across the valley, rattling every shutter in the Holloway home. Eli Mercer swore he heard the laughter again, louder this time, closer. It rolled through the fog in waves, first the sound of children, then something else beneath it, a deeper, older voice, like wind forced through a hollow bone. The animals in his barn kicked and screamed, refusing to calm until sunrise. When he looked toward the Holloway farm the next morning, he saw smoke rising from the chimney, and two small shapes standing at the edge of the field, side by side, motionless. They stood that way for nearly an hour before turning and walking into the woods. The voices faded with them, leaving only the sound of the wind, but from that night on, no one in Ashford County slept easily again. It was the morning after a long stretch of heavy rain when Margaret Holloway stumbled out of the woods barefoot, her white nightgown torn and streaked with mud. Her hair was tangled, her eyes wide and unfocused, and her skin carried strange scratches that looked less like wounds and more like markings, deliberate and symmetrical. Thomas found her standing near the creek behind their property, staring at her own reflection in the water as if she didn't recognize it. When he called her name, she turned slowly, her lips moving soundlessly before she began to laugh, soft at first, then breaking into sobs. He wrapped her in his coat and carried her home, but she would not speak for hours. When she finally did, her voice sounded strange, like an echo of itself. She said she had been taught a new language by their children, and that once someone learned it, they could never unhear it again. The doctor from town, summoned reluctantly by Thomas, examined her but could make no sense of her condition. Her pulse was steady, her temperature normal, but every few minutes she would pause mid-sentence as if listening to something no one else could hear. When he asked her to explain, she said that Samuel and Clara had shown her how to listen between the sounds, and that the woods were full of voices speaking in that hidden tongue. She smiled faintly as she described it, but the expression was wrong, detached, distant, as though the words weren't her own. The doctor suggested rest and left quickly, refusing to return after nightfall. Over the next few days, Margaret's behavior grew more erratic. She would stand for hours at the edge of the field, her hands clasped as if in prayer, whispering softly to the air. Thomas tried to coax her back inside, but she told him the twins were teaching her, and that he would understand soon. When he asked where the children were, she pointed toward the woods and said they were with the others. The statement chilled him, though he didn't know why. The twins had always been strange, quiet but aware in ways that unsettled him, yet something had shifted. The sense of unease in the house had thickened, a constant hum beneath the walls. Doors creaked open on their own, and the air sometimes carried the faint scent of earth after rain, even when the windows were closed. One evening Thomas woke to find Margaret gone again. The house was silent, the children's room empty. He lit a lantern and followed her footprints through the mud toward the tree line. The woods were darker than he remembered, heavy with fog that clung to his clothes. He heard whispers ahead. Margaret's voice mingled with two others, light and melodic, almost childlike. When he reached a clearing, he saw her kneeling before the twins, who stood barefoot in the mud, their hands raised as if in benediction. They were whispering in that strange, rhythmless language, and Margaret repeated each sound with a smile. Her eyes shone with tears, but not of fear, of joy. When Thomas called her name, all three turned to face him at once. The children's mouths stopped moving, yet the whispering continued, coming from somewhere above and around him. He stumbled backward, clutching the lantern, the flame flickering wildly. The next morning he brought her home again. She was calm now, almost serene, though she refused to speak about what had happened. Instead, she spent her days drawing symbols on the walls and floor with charcoal, the same spirals and circles the twins had drawn before. She said they were lessons, that they helped her remember the words. Thomas didn't sleep after that. He could hear them whispering even when the house was still. The twins, Margaret, and something else, something deeper that seemed to hum beneath the earth. Whatever language she had learned, it had changed her. And from that moment on, she no longer looked at her husband the way she once did. When she smiled, it was with the same knowing calm that lived in her children's eyes, as if she too now understood whatever secret had made them defy nature. The storm came without warning. By dusk, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel, and the air was so thick with electricity that the trees seemed to hum. Thomas Holloway was in the barn when he heard the first crack of thunder. It wasn't like the usual Kentucky storms that rolled in from the west with steady rain and gentle wind. This one came from nowhere, splitting the silence like a scream. He rushed back toward the house, shouting for Margaret, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of wind. The rain fell sideways, hard and cold, pelting the windows as if trying to force its way inside. By the time he reached the porch, lightning had already struck the hill behind the house, lighting up the sky in blinding flashes. Through one of those flashes, he saw the twins standing at the window, watching the storm without fear, their faces illuminated white against the glass. Inside, the lamps flickered violently, the flames bending toward the walls as if drawn by an invisible current. Margaret was sitting on the floor, her back straight, her eyes open and unblinking. She was humming the same low tune Thomas had heard her whispering in her sleep for weeks. When he tried to move her, she didn't resist, but her gaze never left the children. Samuel and Clara turned from the window, their expressions blank, but their movements synchronized, too smooth for children. The air grew heavier with every passing second until it was hard to breathe. Then came the smell. Smoke, faint at first, then sharp and burning. Thomas looked toward the hearth and saw that the fire had grown wild, licking the walls as if fed by something unseen. He grabbed a bucket of water and threw it, but the flames hissed and spread faster, crawling across the floor like living things. He shouted for everyone to get out, but the twins didn't move. They stood hand in hand, staring into the growing inferno as if mesmerized. Margaret rose to her feet slowly, still humming, and stepped toward them. Thomas grabbed her arm, begging her to leave, but she only smiled faintly and said the fire wasn't meant to harm them. It was their passage. The word chilled him. The wind outside grew stronger, shaking the walls, rattling the roof. The sound was deafening now, thunder and wind merging into something that almost resembled a voice. Then, in one instant, the flames surged upward, consuming the curtains, the furniture, the ceiling beams. Heat and smoke filled the air, and the lanterns exploded, showering sparks across the floorboards. Thomas stumbled toward the door, coughing, his vision blurred by the smoke. He turned once more to see the children still standing there, untouched by the fire, their silhouettes sharp and unmoving amid the chaos. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like glass. He screamed for them, but they didn't answer. The last thing he remembered before collapsing outside was Margaret's voice, calm and steady, whispering words in that strange language, the same rhythmic murmur that seemed to weave through the roar of the storm. Then came the final crack of lightning, brighter than anything he had ever seen, and the house erupted in flame. By the time the storm passed, the Holloway home was nothing more than a skeleton of charred beams and glowing embers. When the neighbors arrived at sunrise, drawn by the smoke, they found Thomas half-conscious in the mud, his clothes burned, his eyes wide with shock. He couldn't speak, could barely point toward the ruins. They searched through the wreckage for hours, but there were no bodies, no trace of Margaret, Samuel, or Clara. The fire had burned hot enough to warp the iron bed frame, but the cradle in the corner of what had been the nursery was untouched, its wood unscorched. Inside it lay 2 small handprints pressed into the ash, perfectly formed, as if left behind on purpose. The neighbors carried Thomas away, and though he lived, he never spoke again. Some said he had gone mad. Others whispered that the fire had taken everything but what the Holloways truly were, and that whatever they had become, it had simply gone back to where it came from. When the final night came, the town was silent as a grave. The moon hung low, heavy and red, casting its dull glow across the Ashworth property like a warning carved into the sky. Inside the decaying house, every shadow seemed alive, twitching and stretching as if the darkness itself was breathing. The family had locked themselves inside for 3 days, their windows covered, their doors barricaded. Neighbors who dared to come near claimed they heard whispers coming through the cracks, soft, childlike voices chanting something in a language that wasn't English, their tone calm but inhumanly rhythmic. Then, on the 4th night, the sound stopped. The following morning, Sheriff Dalton arrived with 2 deputies after a nearby farmer reported seeing smoke rise from the property. What they found would never make it into any official record. The house was burned from the inside, as if ignited by something that started within its very walls, yet no sign of an accelerant or lightning strike was ever found. The strange part, the wood beams of the house were charred black, but the grass outside was untouched, still green and damp with morning dew. Inside, the rooms were warped, the air thick with an odor of metal and something sweeter, something that made the deputies gag before they could identify it. There were no human remains, no bones, no ash, nothing but melted shapes of furniture and walls that seemed to have fused into each other. But the sheriff found something buried under what used to be the nursery floorboards, a set of tiny footprints, perfectly preserved in the soot. They were too small for an adult, yet they were deep, as though whoever made them carried the weight of a full-grown man. They led from the corner of the room to the window and then simply stopped. No exit, no drag marks, just a clean end to a trail that shouldn't have existed. That discovery haunted him until the end of his life. The sheriff retired 2 years later, reportedly after suffering from what he called the calling. A constant whisper he claimed followed him whenever he was alone. In his final days, he scrawled something across the walls of his house in charcoal. They walk before they breathe. They breathe before they're born. Those words were found after his disappearance in 1881, when he simply vanished from his bed one night without a trace, leaving behind only a cracked window and the smell of burned wood. Over time, people stopped speaking about the Ashworth family. The land was sold, burned again by unknown causes, and then abandoned entirely. But on certain nights, travelers still report seeing small, pale figures walking along the road where the old house once stood, their steps soundless, their eyes reflecting light like glass. Some say they move in unison, their heads turning toward anyone who watches too long. Others swear that if you listen closely near the ruins, you can hear the faint patter of footsteps beneath the earth, as if something is still walking just below the soil, waiting for a chance to rise again. And if you ever find yourself driving through that stretch of Kentucky after midnight and see something small moving along the tree line, don't stop, don't look back, just keep driving. Because some things that defy nature were never meant to be seen, let alone remembered. So if this story sent a chill down your spine, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.